What is the craziest job you've ever worked? I'm talking about the kind of job that you sometimes have dreams or even nightmares that you're still there, and you wake up breathing a sigh of relief that isn't your life anymore. Now, I've had a lot of different jobs. I've been a waiter, a bartender, a record store manager, a professional poker player, an insurance salesman, a claims... What's that? Yeah, a professional poker player. For multiple years, my job was to win at poker. I never told you about that? Well, this is the story of my biggest L, a moment that still haunts me, which followed the craziest hand of poker. Like a lot of young men in the early 2000s, I watched the World Series of Poker on ESPN and became enamored with the idea of going from being just an ordinary dude to rich and famous for playing a game that anyone could pick up. This was a pretty common thing in those days, with many of us donning our hoodies and sunglasses and driving to our nearest casinos to make complete asses of ourselves, or depositing paychecks onto online poker sites like Full Tilt and PokerStars, only to get our asses handed to us, or worse, losing to actual cheers and rigged software. But I had one advantage over most of my peers. See, I grew up surrounded by gambling. No joke, before I turned 10, I was handicapping football and basketball games for my father. Yes, just like that episode of The Simpsons when Lisa did that. The Simpsons did so much, they even ripped off my life. I also grew up going to bars to watch sports that may or may not have been mob-controlled, where old Italian men chewed cigars in front of stacks of $20 bills, which they would use to bet each other on whether a single football play would be a run or a pass. So I knew going in just how much damage gambling could actually do to a man. So how did I do? Well, one day I deposited $25 on PokerStars. A couple weeks later I deposited 25 more, and I never deposited again. Because I never had to. You remember that kid in school who was kind of good at anything he tried? Like, you give him any game, any sport, anything that was brand new, and he would just automatically be better than everyone else? That was me. I used to love gym class because every week there was something new to just dominate at. Scooter soccer, street hockey, basketball. Once in 8th grade we were playing football, and I dropped an absolute 40-yard dime on the back shoulder of Chris, who was running in full stride. My gym teacher's head whipped around at me in disbelief, and after class he pressed me to try out for football, which I immediately never did. Because you see, the thing about that type of person is that the fire just doesn't burn all that long. We get bored real easily and lose interest, even if it's something we're naturally good at. Jack of all trades, master of none. That's the expression, and that was me. But unlike damn near everything else I tried, poker was different, because when I first picked it up, it punched me in the mouth. On this chart, there are 3 poker hands. 3 moments that, despite the hundreds of thousands, if not millions of hands that I've played, have become burned into my mind, living there as long as I will. But before we get there, we need to go over some of the fundamentals. Not in poker, but in poker storytelling. I've heard enough boring poker hand stories in my time that I think I have it broken down to a science. Essentially, there are 3 main attributes to a story involving a poker hand. 3 aspects with which you can judge whether or not the hand is a story that is interesting enough to tell. So the next time you're making small talk with other players or the dealer, you can consider whether or not your hand is worth their attention. And remember, there's a lot of old guys in these card rooms. Many of them don't have much time left on this earth. So it's pretty rude if your story is just ass. Number 1, unlikeliness. This is something that every poker story has. This happened, but then this happened. Pfft, what are the odds? But this is also the fatal flaw of a bad poker story, because over time, everything becomes likely. You're talking about a game in which profit is generated by optimization winning out over probability and time. And you're almost always telling that story to people who play the game, so no amount of unlikeliness is all that surprising. That, coupled with the fact that almost every poker story is one in which the teller of the story loses, means the story itself becomes very predictable. It's like a movie in which you already know the outcome before the movie starts, and you generally know the plot twist before the end of the first act. I'll show you what I mean with this first hand. when the game punched me in the mouth. Around the time I made my first deposit, my buddy Jason did as well. A few weeks later, I have around $20 left, and so does he. One night we're chatting on AIM, and we decide, screw it, let's put our accounts on the table of a cash game, which we did, only we were at different tables. Then this hand occurred, and honestly, the AOL Instant Messenger chat log is the perfect way to express it. Me. Got queen. Jason. Nice. Me. Flopped quads, lol. Quads is 4 of a kind. Jason. LOL. Me. I lost. Jason. What? I ended up having to show him the hand history in order for him to even believe me. Statistically, I was a 99.8% favorite on the flop, with my opponent needing to hit very specific cards in a row in order to win, which he did, and I lost. Now, the unlikeliness factor of this hand is off the charts, but as a poker story, it sucks. And you know why? Because of the second factor. Number 2, context. A good story has to have context. Without it, Rocky is just the story of a boxer in a boxing match that he doesn't even win. But knowing what's at stake, what the character was going through just to get there, and what they stand to gain in the end adds depth. It makes a story come alive. Looking back at this hand, what was the context? I lost $20. Like one of those old, possibly connected Italian gentlemen betting run or pass. That's all that happened. Was it unlikely that my 2 queens turned into 4 queens before losing to a royal flush? Sure. But no matter how you dress it up, I lost $20. So this hand, while being 5 stars for unlikeliness, is 0 for context. Overall, it's a pretty crummy hand story. So let's move forward a bit. By now I'm starting to figure out not just how to win at the game, but the way of becoming a serious player. See, poker is a lot like school, only instead of grades, there are stakes. You start playing low stakes. When you win enough, you move up. If you can't win there, maybe you move back down. Okay, maybe it isn't like school. But what's important is that it takes discipline to stay where your skill and bankroll can afford you. I mentioned my friend Jason before, and nice a guy that he is, I knew that he would never follow me on this path. Remember how I said that we deposited our first $25 and both had around 20? Well, my account had hovered around that amount playing the lowest stakes that there were. Jason's had ballooned up to 200 before he lost it all, redeposited, ran it up again, lost it again, and was on deposit number 3 in just a few weeks. He would just always go in these wild swings, playing way out of his depth until all of his money was gone. He didn't have the discipline. So it's about 3 months in, and while I'm not setting the world on fire, my bankroll is slowly climbing and my discipline is growing stronger. This is where we find hand number 2. Before the flop, my opponent is all in and I call. On the probability scale, it's not all that spectacular. I'm only a 54% favorite here. Ooh, that's pretty painful. We'll bump this up to a 3 on improbability. Still, in the grand scheme of things, this isn't all that bad, so why is it here? This is why context becomes so important. Because this hand didn't take place in some low-stakes game on the internet. It was in a real casino, on a real table with real chairs, real felt, and real chips. Oh yeah, and it was in the World Series of Poker. Oh, and my opponent was Phil Hellmuth. If you were to ask a random person on the street to name a professional poker player, and they could, odds are pretty good that it would be Phil Hellmuth. He's known as the poker brat because he would just throw fits sometimes when he wasn't winning. He'd yell at players, yell at the dealer, yell at anyone who would listen. It was just his persona, like a character he played on television, one that made him a celebrity. So a few months into my career, I've grinded my way up to about $500, and I decided it would be a good idea to save up $2,000, fly to Vegas, and play in an event at the World Series of Poker. Which I did. I go there, I take my seat, the tournament starts, and on my left is an empty chair. I actually made a joke that it's Hellmuth's seat because that's something he always did. He just showed up late for tournaments. Well, 2 hours in, Phil walks up to the table and immediately says the most Phil Hellmuth thing ever. "Sorry I'm late. Another company wants to pay me $1 million to do a commercial." Then he does the most Phil Hellmuth thing ever, immediately picking up pocket aces and doubling his stack to just below mine. I mostly tread water for a while, not really getting any spots, when I look down at pocket fives. I'm under the gun, meaning I'm the first player to act, and decide to just limp in, meaning to call the blind. Now, if you're watching this and you played poker, this should probably stand out to you as just how phenomenally bad I actually was at the time, relatively speaking. Because if you were to ask any competent player, they would probably say that trying to call here with my stack is just a terrible idea. In fact, it's probably the only terrible idea. As soon as I call, Phil announces he's all in, and everyone else folds back to me, and I just sit there, thinking for a while. I count out the amount to call for my chip stack, and it would absolutely cripple me if I were to lose. I want to call so bad. I mean, just for the story. Finally, Phil says another instantly Phil thing when he says, "Come on, kid, when are you going to get another chance to bust me?" I call. The flop is dealt, and I didn't even see the queen or the five. I just watched Phil fist pump the air when he saw one, and then his head drop in disappointment at the other. Then the turn, he doesn't move. Then the river, and he explodes in celebration. To this day, that's still the most surreal part of it. An incredibly wealthy man paid $1,500 in a poker tournament, showed up 2 hours late, when his chips had been whittled down to hardly anything. He wins a hand that would have meant more to me than he could possibly fathom, and less to him than I could, yet he celebrates like our roles are completely reversed. Phil now has most of my chips. I was knocked out a few hands later, and Phil less than a half hour after that. In the end, we were both right. It was the only chance I'd ever have to bust him, and for me, what I lost was worth it, just for the story. That's context. That's what makes this hand almost one worth telling. Okay, just as a sidebar, while I was in Vegas, I saw the craziest hand I've ever seen that I wasn't involved in. In fact, I wasn't even at the table. It was the table next to mine. I'm playing at Caesars, and there's a middle-aged Asian man at the table next over who is very loud and visibly drunk, to the point that the floor man and the security are basically hovering around the table. He starts getting into it with a younger player, talking trash, being goofy, and on one hand, both of their chips end up in the middle, and it is a lot of chips. The younger player had gone all in, and the drunk Asian man called, saying he had a flush. He started demanding that the younger player show his hand, which he did. Now it's the Asian guy's turn to show his hand. And that's how this all works. Only he refuses to. He just keeps shouting, "I have a flush, I have a flush," while protecting his cards. This isn't really going to work because it's a game in which we can't just take your word at face value. You have to actually show your cards at some point, and this is that point. The floor director comes over and he just keeps repeating, "I have a flush, I have a flush." Finally, the floor man tells him, "You need to either show your hand or you forfeit." So what does the Asian guy do? Well, he suddenly and violently vomits all over the table. The chips, the cards, some players, and the dealer, everybody gets splashed. Security drags the guy out immediately. Now, what all of us are wondering in that moment is, what did he have? The younger guy, who just won a huge pile of vomit-covered chips, must have thought it too, and he reached through the puke to turn the guy's cards over. He had the flush. Why he didn't want to show anyone was anybody's guess. Casinos are weird places, and sometimes things happen that man is just not meant to understand. So it's a couple years later, and my climb continues. I'm rising through the stakes slowly but surely. I study up on bankroll management, the general strategy being that whatever stakes you're currently playing, you want to have at least 100 buy-ins in reserve in order to minimize the risk of variance. I take that idea and double it. 200 buy-ins is my limit, ultra conservative. I open a second account on Full Tilt, keep climbing, minimal risk, eyes on the prize. I notch some impressive tournament results. My first 4-figure score, then another, then my third. My bankroll reaches 5 figures and I just keep surging. Then I lose my job. Shit! I immediately transition into being a full-time professional poker player, withdrawing money regularly for rent, bills, and I get to work grinding. I set hours, limits, I make a schedule, and I stick to it. I'm doing this damn thing. I'm working for myself. The week after I lose my job, my girlfriend and I are supposed to meet some friends for dinner at the Cracker Barrel. She comes over to pick me up, and we are gonna be late. It's Sunday, the juiciest day for poker tournaments, and I have a deep run going. Full tilt, 24K guaranteed, $32 entry fee. When all is said and done, we hug, we drive to dinner, meet our slightly annoyed friends, eat chicken and rice and hash brown casserole, and celebrate that I had just turned $32 into more than $8,000. Then I proceeded to make one of the worst decisions of my life. See, winning does funny things to you, particularly if you've spent most of your life being a loser. To me, success felt like something I wasn't supposed to have. Like it should have gone to somebody else and I'd stolen it. I made the decision to stop playing poker professionally and to use my winnings to try and get a real job. I got some clothes, I went in for some interviews, and I got my job in sales. I did that for close to a year, and even though I was decent at the hustle, it wasn't for me. When I worked in restaurants, I was that dude that could sell anything. You give me like a dinner special, and it'll be sold before you know it. But this was different. Those people I sold to wanted a meal. I was just steering them towards the one I wanted them to get. This was selling people things they didn't know existed and probably didn't even want. And that just didn't feel good. So even though I was modestly successful at it, I walked away, and I walked back to poker. Whoops, there goes half my bankroll for bills and rent and food and clothes. I had to move back in stakes and get back on the grind. I mentioned before that there were 3 components to a good poker hand story. Unfortunately, if you don't play the game, the third one may be a little lost on you, but it actually is the most important. See, when poker players tell boring poker stories, they're usually telling them to other players, and what they're looking for is sympathy. They want you to hear their tale of woe and go, "Oh wow, that sucks, I'm so sorry." But it never works out that way because, as I've already said, we all get unlucky. That's why the only truly great poker hand stories are ones which are 1. Unlikely, 2. Have context, and 3. Have strategic interest. The poker player will almost never be compelled by probability because everything becomes probable when you play enough. The context can help, but those moments are very rare, like the time you could have busted Phil Hellmuth but didn't. But if a player can hear your hand and is compelled to think about it from the point of strategy, how it was played, how else it could have been played, and what the optimal strategy and outcome were, now you have a good hand story. Going back to my punch me in the mouth hand, there is no strategy. Before the flop I raised with queens, which I should have. I called my opponent's bet, which I should have, and I called us all in, which I should have. No points for analysis whatsoever. In the Hellmuth hand there's a little bit of strategy. I should have folded in the first place. I had about 12 big blinds, so calling shouldn't have been an option. If I raise, I'd have to go all in, but I was first to act, making this a horrible spot to push because that raise would have to go through 9 players, and if any of them calls me, I'm probably toast. So using even a modicum of strategy in this hand, it never should have happened. This is the story of the craziest hand of poker. The hand I still think about and pore over even after all these years. The PokerStars 30K at 7 p.m. was always one of my favorite tournaments. $11, thousands of players, every single night. I'd final tabled it a couple times and even won it once, so when I returned to playing seriously and made a deep run in it, it was almost nostalgic, like revisiting your old stomping grounds. By then my girlfriend and I had moved in together into an apartment, and there was this newfound pressure I'd been feeling. Responsibility. I was responsible for keeping this roof over our heads while she went to school. It was scary, but also kind of exhilarating. I'm on my laptop in the corner of the room playing poker and trying to keep us from having to eat banquet turkey and gravy on white bread. She's asleep with an early class, and the dark bedroom is lit by the glow of my computer screen. I was eager to notch my first 4-figure score since coming back. The field was big that day, so first place was over $11,000. 5 figures. I had the chance to smash through one barrier and clean through the next one I had never reached before. We're down to the final table, and the player on my right has a monster stack, close to 2 million in chips. There are some players hovering around $1 million, but the rest of us are dangerously short. The final table in poker tournaments is where things start to get really interesting from a strategy perspective. See, even though it's a great achievement, No one wants to get knocked out and end up with that ninth place money. It's around $500, which is a great return on $11, but with how rare these moments are and how much more money is up top, you want to climb the pay ladder as high as you can, and this affects the way everyone plays. If you're towards the bottom in chips, you want to pick your spots very carefully and try to build a stack so you're not such an easy target. This is also usually where the player with the most chips just starts bullying everyone else, just taking pots because they have a fuck you stack and they can. But that's really not happening here. The player with the big stack is just kind of hanging back, letting us lesser beings try and eat each other. We get down to 8. Next one out receives $700, and I am sinking to the bottom of the chip counts when finally, my moment arrives. I'm in the big blind, the button raises, I move all in, and he calls. Jacks. 9s. They hold, and I win. With that double up, I'm now in more than comfortable shape to move up the pay ladder, and I'm sneaking up to close behind the chip leader. I win a couple more pots, and the chip leader knocks someone out. Down to 7. Next player out receives $900. I have 1.8 million, and the chip leader has 2.2. Everyone else is running on fumes, and all I need is for one of them to get knocked out, and the 4-figure score is mine. The only thing that could stop me would be if I were to get into a massive hand with the chip leader and lose everything. Pocket jacks. The chip leader raises under the gun, and I make a small re-raise. He calls. Jack, 7, 10. He checks. I make a small bet. He calls. 10. He checks. I make a larger bet. He calls. Queen. He moves all in. One of the most misunderstood or misconstrued things about poker is reading people. There's a famous scene in the movie Rounders where Matt Damon watches John Malkovich eat an Oreo. Then Damon folds his hand face up and tells Malkovich exactly what he has. That's a movie, though. It just doesn't happen. In fact, that isn't even how reading people works at all. Sure, you can find clips of Daniel Negreanu telling people what they have, but what you'll notice is that it's usually towards the end of the hand, not on the flop. See, while almost no poker hands make for good stories, they are all stories. Stories that make sense when you see them on TV and you know what everyone has. But when you're playing, you don't have the information. You're in the dark, and you're trying to fill in the gaps of the story of what you don't know. Reading hands is like trying to make sense of a story as it progresses with limited information. You'll often hear the term ranges used here. To read your opponent is to apply a range of hands that when you plug it into the story in your mind, it starts to make more sense. Daniel Negreanu says out loud a hand that makes sense. Sometimes he's right and it makes for good television. In Rounders, Matt Damon looking at John Malkovich and knowing exactly what he has makes as much sense as turning off a football game at halftime because you know, with absolute certainty, precisely what the final score is going to be. Queen on the river. He moves all in. We have the 5th best hand that is even possible with this board. So let's apply a range of hands here. King, king, and ace, ace are almost certainly out because he would most likely have re-raised me before the flop. Queen, queen is somewhat reasonable considering I re-raise an under-the-gun raiser and he may be wary that I have kings or aces. 10-10, also reasonable, as is 7-7. But we only beat one of those. Ace-king is off the table. He made us straight on the river, but he would be dead to any flush or any of the above hands, which are all certainly in our range. He would check the river for pot control. He wouldn't move all in. Ace-queen is even more insane. He could have the flush and we're winning, but that means he has ace-9 or maybe ace-5 of diamonds, as those are the only ones that are even remotely close to reasonable here. Then there are the X factors, ace-king or 8-9 of diamonds. I think he'd re-raise ace-king before the flop, but he has been conservative, plus losing to a rivered straight flush? Man. If I call and win, he's crippled, and I have 2/3 of all the chips on the table. I'm basically guaranteed at least the $6,500 for a second. If I lose, $900. I have jacks full of tens, an absolutely monstrous hand, but I can't seem to stitch together a story that makes sense in which we ride off into the sunset. I move my mouse over and hit the button to call. My computer beeps, showing me his queen, and it was over. I crawl into bed, kiss my girlfriend in the head, and the hand starts replaying in my mind where it's been ever since. The next day, people on poker forums actually talk about the hand a bit. Some say I was foolish to even mess with the big stack, that I shouldn't have re-raised an under-the-gun raiser who could knock me out. Others say I was utterly fearless and just took a bad beat. A few weeks later, I wake up on a Friday and am greeted to the same sight as the entire American online poker community, a day that would come to be known as Black Friday. In one fell swoop, the United States government shut down the world of online poker. It took some time, but eventually got my $20K back, and for the most part, that was the end of my pursuit of the game. I'd occasionally play in casinos or card rooms, and I even dealt for a while, but the fire had been extinguished. All except for one hand and one decision that has stayed with me forever.